The forest smelled like rain and pine green, alive and a little wild. Illyra rolled her suitcase along the gravel path and felt the kind of quiet that makes your shoulders drop. No city horns, no blinking notifications, no deadlines. Just birdsong and the hush of the trees. A weathered sign read Hollow Creek Cabins, and beyond it, her weekend escape stood in Goldenwood, a small A-frame tucked beneath tall firs, its window catching the last orange light. She'd booked the cabin impulsively after a month that felt like running through a storm in heels. Her plan was simple: sleep, read, forget how to say urgent. She keyed in the code, pushed the door, and breathed out. Inside, warm plank floors, woven blankets piled in a basket, a stone fireplace with ashes waiting to glow again. A handwritten note on the table said, "Welcome." Firewood stacked on the porch. Creek down the trail to the left. She smiled, stretched her fingers over the note, and imagined whoever had left it some kind caretaker with soft hands and a habit of making tea. The kettle sat on the stove like a promise. She set her phone to airplane mode, then laughed at herself for doing it like it was a rebellion. It was. She wandered the small space, a loft bed under a skylight, a little desk facing the trees, a book of local hikes. On the back of the book, someone had scribbled, "If it rains, the deer come closer." It did rain. A sudden, silver curtain. The roof sang. Illyra opened the door and stood under the frame, letting cool mist kiss her cheeks. She remembered the last time she felt this kind of calm, maybe childhood. She hugged her sweater tighter and decided to light the fire. But the logs were damp and her first attempt fizzled. She tried again. Nothing but smoke. When the third try turned into coughing, a shadow crossed the porch. "Need a hand?" a voice asked, deep, careful, like he didn't want to startle her. Illyra turned. He was tall, wet curls flattening under the rain, shirt clinging to a chest that said he worked with his hands more than keyboards. He carried an armful of dry kindling and wore a grin that looked a little shy on such a solid face. "Hi," she said, and her voice sounded small in the soft thunder. "I swear I'm coachable." "I'm Theo," he replied, stepping back, from the main lodge. "We keep emergency drywood for days like this." He didn't step inside until she held the door wider. He shook off rain and knelt at the hearth, building a nest of twigs and pine curls. His fingers moved with quiet confidence, like reading Braille only he understood. The flame caught, it grew, it crackled. Heat bloomed across the room, gentle as a hand between her shoulder blades. Illyra realized she was smiling too much and tucked her lower lip between her teeth. "Thank you," she said. "I was starting to make peace with frostbite." Theo glanced back, eyes the color of wet bark. "Happy to save your weekend." He stood, and the fire painted his jaw in amber. She noticed the scar that nicked his eyebrow, the rain still beating on his lashes, the way he looked away when their eyes held too long. It wasn't a practiced charm, it felt like something truer. "Anything else you need?" he said, nodding toward the note on the table. "Call the lodge phone. Cell service can be moody." "I turned mine off," she confessed. "I'm detoxing." He smiled. "Then come find us if you want company. Or I can stop by tomorrow to check the firewood." She hesitated. The cabin felt safe, and so did he, and the rain made the world small. "Stop by," she said. "If you want." "I will," he said. He lifted a hand like he was tipping a hat he wasn't wearing and stepped into the rain. The door closed on cool air and the smell of smoke and pine. Illyra stood there a long moment, warmed from inside out for reasons that had nothing to do with the fire. That night she climbed the loft ladder, pulled a blanket over her legs, and watched storm clouds drift across the skylight. The rain slowed to a hush, then a whisper. She thought about Theo's careful hands. She thought about his "yes I will" and the quiet certainty in it. When sleep came, it arrived sweet and heavy. In the morning, the world was polished clean. Mist hung in the trees like silk. Illyra brewed coffee and sipped it on the porch, wrapping both hands around the mug because it felt good to hold something warm. A deer stepped delicately across the trail and froze when it saw her, ears like antennae catching secrets. She smiled into her cup. Maybe the note was right. Bootsteps on gravel. She looked up. Theo was there, carrying a small basket bread, eggs, a jar of dark honey. "Welcome breakfast," he said. "Cabin tradition." Illyra reached for the basket, their fingers brushing, and felt the tiniest thread pull in her belly. "Thank you. Thought I'd show you the creek after," he said, eyes flicking to the trees. "If you feel like a walk." "I do," she said, surprised at how quickly the words came. "Good," he murmured. "There's a bend where the water slows. It's my favorite place." She held his gaze, the morning quiet stretching thin as glass. "Show me," she said. He smiled, and there was something in it that felt a little like promise. They followed a narrow trail that stitched through ferns and tall foxglove, the world damp and glowing. Illyra walked behind Theo at first, watching how easily he moved over roots and stones. He pointed out a red mushroom like a tiny lantern, a cluster of salmon berries blushing on their stems, the pale prints of a raccoon near the creek. He talked about the forest like it was a friend with moods. "What about the scar?" she asked before she could stop herself. "On your eyebrow." He touched it, surprised into a smile. "Oh. I earned that one falling out of a tree when I was 12. Thought I could reach a kestrel nest." The kestrel disagreed. "Did you get in trouble?" "My mom couldn't stop laughing long enough to scold me." He looked back at her. "What about you? Any scars?" "Just one," she said softly, hand on her ribs where no one could see. "A silly surgery. Not dramatic." "Still a story," he said. "Even a quiet one." They reached the bend in the creek where the water slowed and widened. A fallen cedar made a natural bench. Sun was pushing the morning fog away, and the light dappled the surface. It was easy to sit in that kind of place and forget the size of the world. Theo set the basket down and poured coffee from a thermos he'd somehow tucked beneath the towel. He handed her a cup and their fingers met warm skin to warm skin this time, and no one rushed to let go. Illyra looked away first, flushed, then returned his gaze because it felt worse not to. "Thank you for this," she said. "For the rescue, the breakfast, the bend in the creek. Some places are better shared," he said simply. They talked about small things that felt big when spoken softly, the particular way bread tastes when eaten outside, how mornings are different in the city, the art of remembering to breathe. Theo told her he runs maintenance for the cabins but spends most days out here clearing trails, checking bridges, patching roofs. "The job is to fix what's broken," he said, then added, "and keep what's good." She told him she was a designer, the kind who smooths out complicated apps until they look simple. He liked that. "So you fix what's broken, too," he said, and she felt seen in a way she hadn't expected. When the sun rose higher, they walked back, slower than before. The quiet between them wasn't empty. It hummed a little. Near the cabin, a breeze lifted Illyra's hair, and she pushed it behind her ear. Theo's eyes followed the motion, not greedy, just attentive, and the hum inside her turned into a warm thrum. "Dinner?" he asked at the door, trying to sound casual and not quite managing it. "I can show you the grill on your deck. The lodge has salmon." "Illyra," she said, offering her hand. "I realized I never told you my name." "Illyra," he repeated, her name fitting his mouth in a way that made her want to hear it again. "Dinner?" "Yes," she said, and her yes felt brave. "7. 7, he echoed. After he left, she wandered the cabin aimlessly, fingers skimming surfaces as if the room could steady her, which it did, and also didn't. She changed her sweater twice, then laughed at herself and changed back. She braided her hair and unbraided it. She put on music, the slow kind that underlined quiet. The mirror above the sink showed a woman with rain-soft eyes and a small smile she couldn't quite tame. At 7, Theo arrived with a small cooler and a carton of wildflowers tucked in like a secret. "Borrowed from the lodge garden," he said, sheepish. "I'll confess later." "Your crimes are forgiven," she replied, arranging the flowers in a jar. The salmon hissed on the grill. He prepped lemon and herbs with the same careful hands that had built her fire. The deck warmed under the last of the light, and birds stitched calls through the trees. Dinner was simple and perfect, and the wine made the edges of the day go soft. By the time the sky went violet, the air had cooled. Illyra rubbed her arms. Theo stood and, without asking, reached for the blanket by the door. He eased it around her shoulders, his hands lingering for a heartbeat longer than necessary. The entire forest seemed to listen. "Stay," she said when he shifted like he might go. The word surprised her with its steadiness. "Sit with me. Just a little longer." He did. They watched the first star. The second. The fire in the hearth popped inside the cabin, and a band of warmth reached the doorway. Illyra turned, and he turned, and that was when their faces found the same air. Close enough to smell cedar and smoke and something that was wholly him. He hesitated, eyes searching hers. "Okay," he asked, so quietly she felt it more than heard it. "Yes," she answered, and the yes was not a whisper. It was a door opening. Their first kiss was slow, careful at the edges, like testing the temperature of a lake with your toes before diving. The second found more heat. The third learned her mouth. Illyra's hands rose to his jaw, thumb brushing the old scar, and Theo made a sound that rolled through his chest and into her palms. They kissed until the stars multiplied and the wine was only warmth. When they finally drew apart, breath mingled, foreheads touching, Illyra was smiling in a way that reached behind her ribcage and loosened something that had been tied for a long time. "Will you come by tomorrow?" she asked, already greedy for the answer she wanted. "Before breakfast," he promised. And then the forest blinked as a light flared at the edge of the trees, brief, unnatural, like a match struck and snuffed. Theo's head turned sharply, all that easy warmth tightening into alertness. "What was that?" Illyra asked. He stood. "Stay here," he murmured. "I'll check." Theo moved down the steps with the quiet gait of someone who knows the ground. The light didn't return, but the hair at the back of Illyra's neck stood up anyway. She pulled the blanket tight and listened, heartbeat drumming in her ears. A few minutes later, branches rustled, a shape separated from the undergrowth, and Theo reappeared with a crooked smile and a battered lantern in his hand. "False alarm," he said. "Lantern must have slid off a shelf in the storage shed and flickered when it hit." Illyra exhaled, laughing at herself. I was 2 seconds from calling the forest rangers. You would have made their night, he teased, climbing back onto the deck. He set the lantern on the rail, tested the wick, and turned it low so their faces were haloed in soft light. Better. Better, she agreed. But the rush of worry had left a residual heat inside her. She felt oddly more awake, more aware of him, of the night, of the inches between their knees. She shifted closer. He welcomed her without words, arms slipping along the back of her chair, fingers brushing the nape of her neck in a slow, absent-minded caress that made her breath falter. They talked until the lantern burned low. He told her about winter in the forest, how snow makes the world too quiet to believe, and how the creek turns to glass in patches you shouldn't step on. She told him about the way sunrise paints city windows gold, making office buildings look like promises instead of traps. Their stories braided softly. Every once in a while, his hand found hers, and each time their fingers settled together faster. When the chill finally pushed them inside, the fire welcomed them with orange arms. Theo closed the door, and the cabin held a new kind of hush. Not empty at all, brimming, like a held breath. Illurid turned to face him, and he looked at her the way he had by the creek, attentive, listening with more than ears. Stay, she said again, and this time the word meant the night. His answer was a nod that carried 30 meanings. He stepped closer. His hands found her waist like he was remembering a place he'd always known. Her palm slid up his chest, over the damp cotton of his shirt, beneath the open collar where his pulse beat warm. The kiss they shared then was no test of temperature. It was the moment your body dives because the water is exactly right. What happened after moved slowly, with laughter tucked between touches and tenderness unspooling like a ribbon, the brush of lips at her wrist, the soft scrape of stubble at the hollow near her ear, the velvet sound of his voice saying her name like it belonged only to her. Clothing became less of a barrier and more of a conversation. He asked permission to finish, she said yes each time, and each yes deepened, widened, turned the air around them honey thick and bright. When the fire sank to coals, they lay wrapped in blankets on the rug, shoulders brushing, breath sinking. Theo traced a lazy line along her forearm. You are trouble, he whispered into her hair, smiling. Good trouble, she asked. The kind I'm going to think about when I'm 80, he said, and she laughed, then hushed, the kind of hush that comes when you realize your heart is opening doors you didn't plan for. Sleep tugged at them. He kissed her temple and stood slowly. If I don't go, he murmured, I'll never leave. Is that a problem, she teased, already missing the weight of him. For me? Not at all. For my 6 a.m. trail check. He winced, then cupped her face, serious for a heartbeat. Tomorrow. Breakfast. And after that there's a place higher up. The overlook. If you're up for the climb. I am, she said, wonderingly aware of how true it felt. He left with the lantern turned down to a thread. Illyra cleaned up in a dream, climbed the ladder to the loft, and lay beneath the skylight while a blush of moonlight smudged the ceiling. She slept like the forest had moved inside her, every breath leaf green. Morning arrived with birds laughing and a beam of sun poking her eyelids. A knock. She sat up, hair wild, heart sprinting happily. Theo stood in the doorway with a paper bag and an apology on his face. I'm 5 minutes late. You brought carbs, she said, peeking in. Apology accepted. They ate cinnamon rolls on the steps, fingers sticky, shoulders touching. It felt casual and intimate and better than any restaurant. He wiped icing from her lip with his thumb, paused, and she kissed the pad of it, just once. His eyes darkened with something warm. "Ready for the climb?" he asked. She nodded. "Try and keep up." The trail to the overlook started gentle, then turned serious. The air cooled as they gained height, the trees thinned, the sky grew bigger. They stopped for water by a mossy boulder, and Illyra leaned into it, catching her breath. Theo watched her with a fondness that made her want to stand taller and also curl into him. He offered his hand for the next steep stretch. She took it. Neither of them let go when the trail leveled. At the top, the world opened. A sweep of green valley, the creek a bright ribbon, the cabins tiny as toys. Wind tugged at their clothes, playful. Theo stood behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, chin settling on her shoulder. "Welcome to my favorite sentence," he said, eyes on the horizon. "What does it say?" she asked. "Stay," he murmured, so soft the wind almost stole it. "Stay a little longer." Illyra turned in his arms, and the kiss they shared at the overlook tasted like sky. She didn't think about anything sensible. She only thought about this: sometimes life brings you to a place where every yes is simple. When they finally pulled apart, a hawk cut the air above them, slicing silence. Theo's phone buzzed in his pocket. He grimaced, surprised, then checked the screen. The brief frown that crossed his face sent a cold slip down Illyra's spine. "What is it?" she asked. "Storm coming in tonight," he said slowly. "Bigger than last night. And," he hesitated. "A downed tree took out part of the road. Could be we're all up here together for a bit." He looked back at her, apology and something like exhilaration warring in his eyes. "You okay being snowed?" "Well, reined in." Illyra felt the strangest, happiest steadiness settle under her ribs. "With you," she said. "Yes." Theo's smile was bright enough to warm the wind. "Then we have a storm to prepare for." They descended quickly, laughing when the wind pushed them sideways. At the cabin, they made a plan that felt like play: stack extra firewood under the overhang, fill a few pitchers in case the pump hiccuped, pull blankets where they were easy to grab, gather candles and matches and the stubborn lantern that had scared them. Theo promised to check on the neighboring cabins and jog to the lodge to help batten down. "Come back to me," Illyra said lightly, then realized how earnest she sounded. Heat climbed her throat. "I will," he said, and the certainty in it felt like a roof. While he was gone, Illyra made the small space feel readier: a pot of soup simmering slow, mugs lined like soldiers, a stack of books chosen for how they felt in the hand. The first fat drops began to drum the roof by the time Theo returned, hair plastered, shirt slick, grin wide. He shook Rain onto the porch, stepped inside, and let the door thump closed behind him. "Lodge is secure," he reported. "Neighbors are good. One couple is thrilled they brought board games. One solo hiker asked if we have hot chocolate at the lodge. I told him yes. I'll have to invent some." Illyra handed him a towel. He caught her wrist, tugged gently, and pressed a kiss to the inside of it, quick and warm. "Hi," he said, voice lower. "Hey," she replied, breath a little shorter for no practical reason. The room brightened with lightning far away. A few seconds later, thunder rolled its slow drum. The rain found a steadier rhythm, and the creek began to sing a little louder. They ate soup at the table with the rain marking time. Theo told a story about a storm 2 winters ago when the creek jumped its banks and they built a temporary footbridge in an hour, the entire staff working like a single body. Illyra told him about a launch day at work that went sideways until her team quietly rewrote a feature while a manager told the investors jokes. "We saved the day," she said, but the jokes got the credit. He lifted a brow. I'll remember to give credit to the right heroes. You'll need to meet my team, she said, surprising herself with how easily the future climbed into her voice. As the afternoon dimmed into storm-tinted evening, the power blipped, held, blipped again, then sighed into darkness. The cabin glowed with fire and lantern light. The storm shifted from outside weather to something living in the room with them, crackling, humming, alive. Theo lit a candle on the windowsill, Illyra set another by the bed. Shadows stretched long and made everything beautiful. Do you trust me? He asked, stepping closer, candlelight gilding his cheekbones and the soft notch of his throat. Yes, she said, no hesitation. Close your eyes, he murmured. She did. He guided her to the rug near the fire, his hand steady at the small of her back, warm and sure. The flames spoke their soft language. She felt the whisper of his breath near her ear, the press of his palm along her spine, the slow brush of his lips at her temple. I want to learn you, he said quietly. The ways you like to be touched. The words that make you softer. The ones that make you brave. Something in her opened like a window. Then ask me, she whispered. He did. Not all at once, not urgently curious, reverent, attentive. His questions were touches. Her answers were sounds and yes and small, honest words. The storm outside threw bright light across the walls, the storm inside them built to a high tide and then rolled in, warm and complete. When they lay tangled after, the world felt both larger and easier to hold. They dozed, woke, kissed, laughed at the thunder when it overplayed its hand. At some point, Theo tucked her against his chest and began to tell her stories in the dark, little ones he kept like stones in a pocket. She told him a few of hers. Names surfaced. So did fears. He held them like they were ordinary and precious both. Near midnight, a gust of wind slammed the door against its frame and the lantern flickered. Theo sat up. I'll grab more wood before the pile gets soaked. I'll come with you, Illyra said, already standing, tugging on his flannel because it was closest and smelled like him. They dashed into the rain, laughing like children, grabbed armfuls of logs, and staggered back. As they shoved the door closed, lightning ripped the sky and, for a breathless flash, Illyra saw a shape at the edge of the trees, a person, maybe, or a trick of shadows. Did you see? She began. Theo's smile vanished. I did. The door thudded. The rain roared. And for the first time since she arrived, the forest didn't feel entirely like a friend. They stood very still, listening. The rain hissed against leaves, the creek sang louder, the cabin wood creaked in familiar ways. No footsteps. No knock. Nothing but storm. It's probably the couple from cabin 4, Theo said, voice steady but lower. They might have gotten turned around. Or the hot chocolate guy, Illyra offered, trying for lightness and landing somewhere near nervous humor. Theo set the logs down without looking away from the door. I'll check the porch light. If someone needs help, we can bring them in. I'm not staying here alone while you go investigate mysterious shadows, Illyra said. That's how horror movies start. He glanced at her, mouth twitching. You're right. We stick together. They opened the door as one. The porch light haloed rain into a beaded curtain. Beyond it, darkness pooled between tree trunks. Hello. Theo called, voice carrying. Anyone out there? Silence. Illyra stepped close to his side, and he angled his body so that it shielded hers from the open dark without making a show of it. Okay, he said after a moment. Maybe a deer. Or a board loose on the woodpile throwing shadows. Let's lock up, Illyra said softly. And sit by the fire until the storm gets bored. They did. The tension slowly unspooled. Theo put water on to heat because tea makes most things better. Illyra changed into dry clothes and pulled on thick socks. When she came back, he looked at her like the simple act of returning was a gift. He handed her a mug, their fingers tracing the same handle, and the small contact grounded them both. They talked about the shadow because not speaking would have given it teeth. Then they talked about everything else, the best thing they'd each cooked, the worst haircut, the summer he tried to teach himself the violin alone in a tool shed. She laughed so hard at his impression of squealing strings that her eyes spilled. He kissed the tip of her nose to catch a tear and said, "You are trouble," again, and the way he said it wrapped the cabin in warmth. The storm softened. The lights flickered back, then steadied. They didn't bother turning off the lantern or blowing the candles. The glow felt earned. Theo stretched out on the rug and tugged her down beside him. They listened to the new quiet together, hearts in the same slow key. "Stay another day," he said into the hush. "Or two. Let the world be big and far and not our problem." Illyra turned onto her side, tucked a hand beneath her cheek, and studied him. "It might become our problem again Monday." "Monday can be negotiated with," he said, and she laughed, and then neither of them laughed because the feeling under the joke was not a joke at all. They slept. In the thin blue moment before dawn, something woke Illyra, a sound like a soft footfall or a branch giving up. She lay very still, eyes adjusting, sensing more than seeing. The cabin was a study of slow shadows. Theo breathed evenly beside her. The lantern's wick had sunk to a coal. Then, a knock. Not loud, but undeniable. Illyra's heart jumped. Theo was up in a single smooth motion, bare feet soundless, shoulders squared. "Stay," he mouthed, and she shook her head once. He grimaced and gave in 2 steps together to the door. "Who is it?" he called. No answer. He unlatched the chain but kept the deadbolt. "We can help you if you need it." Illyra stood to the side, heartbeat thudding. The silence stretched so thin it almost tore. Theo slid the peephole open and exhaled all at once. "It's the couple from 4, he said, relief loosening his voice. "They're soaked." He opened the door. On the porch stood a man and woman in hiking raincoats, dripping, shivering, both looking apologetic and grateful. "We're so sorry," the woman said. "We thought we were fine but our door stuck and then our fire died and the power was out," and she stopped when she saw Illyra and smiled, embarrassed. "We didn't mean to scare you." "You're safe," Theo said, ushering them in. "Towels. Fire. Sit." They settled the couple near the hearth and wrapped them well. Illyra poured tea with honey and pressed warm mugs into cold hands. The man sighed like his bones were melting. "You two saved us," he said. His gaze bounced between Illyra and Theo, reading the air the way people do when warmth is obvious. He smiled over the rim of his cup. "Storm friends, huh?" "Something like that," Illyra said, feeling a blush and not minding it. By sunrise, the couple had warmed and the storm had remembered how to be ordinary. Theo walked them back to their cabin, made sure the door unstuck, reignited their fire, and returned to Illyra with damp hair and a face that said he wanted to kiss her before breakfast. So she let him. Later, with the day bright and the world rinsed clean again, they took the long loop trail that followed the creek deeper into the woods. The path was soft underfoot. Light hung in the trees like gauze. Illyra reached for Theo's hand absently and kept it deliberately. The silence between them felt like a shared secret. At a point where the creek fanned into a small pool, Theo stopped. "There's a word in a language I don't speak," he said, smiling at his own sentence. "It means the ache you feel when you find something you didn't know your heart had been missing." Illyra's throat went tight. "Do you know the word?" "No," he said. "But I know the ache." She lifted his hand to her lips and kissed his knuckles. "Me too." They stood there until the sun climbed. Then they turned back, not because they wanted to, but because wanting to stay forever is the most excellent reason to go slowly. On the way, the same shadow moved at the edge of sight, not a person, not danger. A deer, delicate and curious, paused to watch them pass. The forest was a friend again. Back at the cabin, Theo leaned against the door frame like he might fuse with the wood if he stood there long enough. "One more night," he said. "Or 3. Or we burn the calendars." She laughed. "We can't burn calendars. We need those." "Fine. We'll just ignore them." Illyra opened the door and faced the small room that had somehow become a world. "I could ignore a lot of things," she said, and felt the truth ring in her chest like a bell. "Then let's start now," he said, and stepped inside with her. By the third morning, the cabin had the comfortable disorder of a place lived in by two people who like each other, a book left open face down because the page was too good to lose, a sweater hanging on the chair where she'd kissed him long enough to forget it, an extra mug on the sill, catching a thin triangle of sun. They fell into a rhythm that felt discovered rather than invented. Breakfast on the steps. A walk short or long, depending on how often they stopped to kiss under an excuse like "look at that mushroom" or "listen to that bird." A nap when the afternoon turned soft. Dinner that was more laughter than recipe. A night that always ended in warmth and a mess of blankets and the kind of conversation people hoard for when they're brave enough to be fully known. They told truths. The kind with edges that can cut if held wrong. Illyra admitted the part of her that worried she works too hard to keep from feeling lonely and sometimes ends up lonelier. Theo confessed the fear that if he left the forest, he might lose himself; if he stayed forever, he might shrink. They listened like it was their job. They learned the small rituals that make loving easier, the way she likes a hand at the small of her back when crossing a stream, the way he relaxes when someone squeezes his shoulder, just once, mid-story. One afternoon, they visited the lodge to borrow a chess set and returned to find the light on the table turned gold like syrup. Theo set up the pieces and explained his promises: "I won't go easy on you, but I will cheer when you take my queen." She laughed and proceeded to do exactly that, then lost the game anyway. He swept the pieces into his palm and kissed her hand in mock reverence. "Do you ever wish for city noise?" he asked later, when dusk turned the windows into mirrors. "Sometimes," she said honestly. "But it's like craving a loud song you danced to 10 years ago. Your body remembers the beat, but your heart wants a different kind of music." "What music does your heart want now?" he asked, and the question wasn't casual at all. "This," she said, not as an answer but a vow. "This kind." They kissed until the answer sunk into skin. The next morning, the road was cleared. A text buzzed on Illyra's phone when she foolishly took it off airplane mode, 3 pings, then more, like pebbles hitting glass. Meetings rescheduled, reminders about drafts, the city tugging gently on her sleeve. She stared at the screen, then set it face down, then picked it up again because pretending the world doesn't exist never made it kinder. Theo read her face and put a gentle hand over the phone. "If you need to go," he said, voice careful, we can do this with calendars intact. We can make a real plan. What does a real plan look like? She asked, trying to keep the quiver out of her voice and maybe failing. He took a breath like he was choosing words instead of grabbing them. You come back in 2 weeks. Or I come to the city next weekend. Or both. We take turns picking places that feel like us. We build something that fits our lives, not the other way around. Illyra swallowed a sudden, stinging gladness. Do you always say the exact right thing? No. But I've learned not to let good things drift away because I was afraid of logistics. She nodded, and the practical world unclenched its teeth a little. Next weekend, she said. I'll send an address. You'll hate the parking. I'll love the part where you open the door, he said, and just like that, distance seemed like something that could be measured in yes instead of miles. They spent the day like a gift they didn't want to unwrap too fast. By evening, the cabins hummed with that after-a-storm contentment. The couple from 4 waved as they passed. The hot chocolate guy gifted them a bar of chocolate he'd bought in town months ago for a rainy day. Theo bowed as if accepting a medal. Back on the deck, they watched the light go peach. Illyra leaned back into Theo's chest and felt his arms wrap around her like he was answering a question she hadn't asked aloud. I'll miss this, she said softly. This. His lips moved against her hair. The trees listening, she said. The way the creek rats me out when I'm happy. She laughed. You. I'll be here, he murmured, even when I'm not. And next weekend I'll be there. They went inside when the night turned cool. They made love with a sweetness that felt like gratitude. After, they lay tangled and talked about ordinary tasks in the tone of people planning an expedition: grocery lists, laundry, the mysteries of subway maps. The ordinary shimmered when placed beside the extraordinary and labeled ours. Just before sleep found them, Illyra propped herself on an elbow. Tell me one last story, she said. He smiled, already half dreaming. Once there was a woman who walked into a forest cabin and found the exact thing she didn't know she was looking for. What was it? She asked, even though she knew. A reason to say yes, he murmured, and slid into sleep. Illyra stayed awake long enough to memorize the sound of his breathing. Then she closed her eyes and let the forest carry her. Morning arrived with a blue sky that made leaving feel like a small betrayal. Illyra packed slowly, folding clothes as if gentleness could erase the ache in her chest. Theo brewed coffee and set a cup by her suitcase like an offering. They moved around each other with a new kind of quiet, a careful one, but not fragile. Will you sign my book? She asked suddenly, holding up the lodge hike guide that had welcomed her on the first day. Under the dear note. He grinned, took the pen, and wrote beneath, if it rains, the deer come closer. His letters were neat and measured. He handed it back and she read, if it storms, so do we together. Beneath it, his number, then, simply, theology. She pressed the book to her chest. I'll keep this where I keep important things. Like cinnamon rolls, he teased. Exactly like that. They loaded her suitcase into the back of her car. The gravel road beyond the trees looked both inviting and treacherous. Theo stood with his hands tucked in his pockets like he didn't trust them to behave if he let them out. I could follow you to the highway, he said, the offer both practical and tender. I'll be okay, she said, though part of her wanted the escort and the excuse for 5 more minutes of him. I don't want you to waste gas. Gas is a myth, he deadpanned. Forests run on coffee and stubbornness. She laughed and that made the moment easier. He stepped closer, pulled her into a hug that was not polite at all, and held her like the imprint might last on his skin. It would on hers. "Next weekend," he said into her hair. "I'll text you when I'm on the way." "Bring a lantern," she murmured into his shirt. "Just in case." He pulled back enough to kiss her softly, then slower, then with a smile that said they were not done, not by a long road. "Drive safe," he said finally, stepping back with visible reluctance. She did. The trees opened, the road widened, the world changed scale. The city rose in the distance like a familiar song. She parked in front of her building, hauled her suitcase up the stairs, and entered her apartment that suddenly felt a size too big until she placed the hike book on her desk and the cabin came back a little. Her phone buzzed. A text: "Missed you before you turned the first bend." She felt her ribs loosen. She typed back, "I missed you before I turned the key." Then, "Brunch next Saturday? I'll pick a place with terrible parking." "Perfect," he replied. "I'll bring flowers I confess to later." The week unfurled. Work reclaimed its river of requests. But Ilora found herself pausing mid-email to taste the memory of rain, of cedar, of the curve of Theo's shoulder under her palm. She bought a plant for the windowsill that looked like something the forest might approve of. She said no to a meeting that didn't need her, yes to a walk after sunset. Every yes nodded toward the cabin. On Friday, a package arrived, a small tin of lodge honey, a Polaroid of 2 mugs on a cabin step, and a note in Theo's neat hand. "For the mornings until our morning," it read. Beneath it, a sketch of a lantern with a tiny heart where the flame would be. Saturday came like a held breath finally released. Ilora stood at her window and watched the street, pigeons strutting, a cyclist humming, the sun leaning down the block. A truck pulled up. Theo climbed out in jeans and the same shy grin that had walked into her life with an armful of kindling. He carried wildflowers that had no business being in a city, and they looked perfect anyway. He buzzed. She pressed the button. He took the stairs 2 at a time. When she opened the door, he looked at her like the week had been the long part of a blink. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she answered, stepping close. He handed her the flowers, then his hand, then the rest of himself, another careful kiss that promised less careful ones later. They pulled apart just enough to breathe. "Ready?" he asked. "For brunch," she teased. "For whatever comes after," he said, eyes steady. She took his hand. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I am." They walked into the bright day and found a little place with terrible parking and perfect coffee. They shared pancakes and plans. Park benches and train rides. Weekenders and weeknights. It didn't matter. The cabin had taught them something that the city couldn't unteach: you build the life you want by saying yes to it, over and over, until it grows around you like a forest. Later, when evening softened the edges of buildings, they returned to her apartment. He set the flowers in a jar and turned to her with that same attentive look that had made her heart open by the creek. He brushed a strand of hair behind her ear and asked, the way he always would, "Okay." "Okay," she said, smiling, and felt the ache and the peace meet in the middle. They kissed, slow and certain, while beyond the window the city lights came on one by one like stars agreeing. And in a cabin under those other stars, the forest listened and approved.